Here, check this thing here. Harp string ensemble, a sort of primitive string simulator. Sounds just as bad now as it did then.
Welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about music documentaries brought to you by Treble Media. I'm David Lizabram, here with my co-host, taking a drink right before he jumps on the mic.
Andrew Keats.
How you doing, Andy?
Doing great, man. How are you?
Excited because we were talking about one of the legendary Rock Docs, I would say, today. Kind of a sneaky surprise hit, this one. Today we're going to talk about the classic albums Asia, or classic albums Steely Dan Asia. I'm not sure exactly what the full title is. It's a film from 1999, directed by Alan Lewens. I want to talk about his filmography, but we'll get there. And it's about the Steely Dan album Asia, which you may be familiar with. And we have our very special guests today are two true experts and Steely Dan fanatics to guide us through this. They are the author and illustrator, respectively, of the new book, Quantum Criminals, Ramblers, Wild Gamblers, and Other Soul Survivors from the Songs of Steely Dan. A really unique and fantastic and fabulous music book, I will say. We've got Alex Pappademas, the author, and Joan LeMay, the illustrator. I don't know, say hi, Alex and Joan, in whatever order you want to say hi.
Hi, David. Hi, Andy.
What's up, guys?
We like to go.
I'm saying hi in order of placement on screen.
Yes.
So above and below.
It's very democratic. Andy, you want to kind of describe this book, first of all?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Alex would probably do a better job than I have, but I would. The way I see it, it's a series of essays, some of which sort of bring you through the history and culture of Steely Dan, and others are pretty, specific jumps into the characters of their music or elements of the of the world that they created around themselves, and they're accompanied by really stellar illustrations of those characters and the members of the band. Is that about right, guys?
It sounds about right. I think I think any description of this book is going to it will not possibly match the experience of if you go to your local bookstore and just go to the music section and pick up this book and start flipping through it. You will walk out owning this book because it looks fabulous, and it every single bit is compelling. It sort of takes the idea that like this is the Steely Dan cinematic universe. Like when I was a kid and I was into comic books, I would get like the Marvel Universe book and like flip through all the pages, and you'd have illustrations of the characters and then like their story. And this is a little bit of that, but for a slightly seedier milieu.
Yeah, Alex, could you tell us a little bit about the conception when you had the strike of inspiration for this and how it developed?
Sure. I should say also that I like literally never far from my desk.
There you go. That's what I was thinking of.
If I need to know like Captain America's weight or something, because that's what it was also. There was really like this has a lot of. I've got these Marvel handbooks like right here.
Did you ever collect the X-Men the Marvel Universe cards in the early 90s that had
After my time, the cardification of comic book collecting was kind of where I got off the bus.
Yeah,
it was like holograms.
What they had though on the back, they would have the like agility and fighting rankings, and it was like all of a sudden all the arguments you had been settled, and you were like, well, I guess we just know who would win between Wolverine and Captain America. It's right here on the card.
Yeah, there's not enough. I think one of the weaknesses of this book is there's not enough information about who would win in a fight between the individual.
Right.
Yeah.
There's always room for a sequel. It's fine.
How much can the expanding man actually expand? That's what I want to know.
Well, it's 12 times his own height. Weight. There's the answer. No, so this was two separate projects. In our respective small rooms of creation on different parts of the West Coast. I had been sort of fooling around with this Steely Dan essay collection that was going to be a bunch of short essays about Steely Dan, and unbeknownst to me, Joan, who I'd known for a very long time, had been working on something separate, where she was going to draw all of the Steely Dan characters. And our friend put us together. Our mutual friend Jessica Hopper, who we were shouting out in every interview because
Jessica
Every
Hopper's the
interview.
best. She's the
the
connection
reason
to
for the
everything.
season. Yeah, no,
have y'all had her on yet to talk about Women Who Rock? Because you should.
She's elusive. She's very friendly and
Yes.
makes connections, but it's almost
She's
like
got a lot going on right now.
Yeah.
Jessica,
Yeah.
if you're listening, the
We're
door's
still
open.
interested. Yeah. Joan, so Joan, what was your
we can
your
lobby her.
project? What were you what form were you considering
So,
putting those illustrations in?
So late, early pandemic time, I had gotten back into the process of making fanzines, because I'm a figurative painter. I like to paint things in massive quantities, much kind of not unlike something that Alex and I have talked about many times, where Alex, with having a magazine background, finds it more psychologically palatable to conceive of there being lots of one type of digestible thing that makes up a large whole versus one giant, uh, uh, long thing. I too, as a painter, will paint 100 of something, and then that's a thing, versus one large painting. Now I paint one large painting also, but then that was not the thing. So I'd gotten back into making fanzines. I made my first zine when I was like 14, and hadn't done it since the 90s. And after I did a couple, I decided that I was going to make a zine called Dan Zine, wherein I planned to draw and paint all named Steely Dan characters and then some. And I made a thing called the Master Daniverse character sheet that listed all 240 however many names and instances of an individual appearing in all of the songs. And I made the cover. I didn't even fucking finish the cover. I like drew the cover, and I did a little something here and there, and then posted it on Instagram in order to hold myself accountable to make this thing. It's sometimes you come up with an idea, and it's an idea that's gonna occupy you for a really long time, and it seems kind of like a dumb idea, but dumb ideas are the greatest ideas a lot of the time, and this was one of those. So I'd posted it on Instagram, and then Hopper and Alex saw it.
And said, well, let's combine these things. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that is, I mean, it's so it's so nice to have imagined a Dan zine. That would have been fantastic as well. But I love the marriage here. It also really reminds me of like pre-social media internet culture. The idea of the illustrations, like it could have been like an early blog, where could have been like a weekly update or something along those lines.
Sure. Yeah.
I I don't think I'd really put it together until I read this, but like I'm really into bands or artists who have these kind of characters and seem to create this world. Like whether it's Bob Dylan, The Grateful Dead, Steely Dan, Guided by Voices. Like I feel like, if I'm pitching you a series now. I think I just decided.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This is the pilot that we have here. But I think I would just eat that up for, and there's probably tons of other artists I'm not thinking of. But like, I like that. I like the the idea that these all the Hold Steady. That's definitely one where there's a lot of crossover there. So anyway, you kind of found something that I love, but I didn't even know about, and that's like kind of what you want in a book, right?
Yeah. So what was your entry into Steely Dan sicko behavior, where you would want to categorize all 240 some characters and draw them?
For me, I'm a lifelong fan. My parents didn't have that many records, but among what they did have was the whole catalog. So it's my first musical memory is listening to Steely Dan, and really they've always been my pat answer to what's your favorite band. I'm not by nature an obsessive fan of anything like this, but I have deep interest in things, and I think that this was just, um I don't necessarily relate to things communally in terms of discussion of fandom so much. I really don't. But this particular project, I was just like, I love them very much, and I recognized that there was this massive um, populace of characters, and I'm a portraitist at heart, and so a lot of my work previously was, paintings. I'm a big Alice Neal fan. I'm a big Myra Kalman fan. A lot of my paintings previously were paintings of people with, faces, and I was like, what a this is this is like a universe of people that I can, you know, put together, use what's in my head and other things, and just have it be a sustainable um, big long project. But i'm not prone I'm not prone to this behavior, but once I went down the road, once I decided to go down the road, it was a I was excited about doing it. And then, the joy of joys was that Hopper put Alex and I together, and then that's really, you know then we made this thing. Now we have this thing
Yeah.
that we made.
Uh, while we're talking about the illustrations, I'm curious. For these characters, I mean, do you use like models, or were they based on real people, or just totally made up? And in terms of the like, especially the characters, most of which are like existing in the 70s primarily, because that's when
Mhm.
most of Steely Dan's recorded output occurred. Was there a lot of research into that era that you did, watching movies or photos, or just like your own memories, or a kind of just vibe of the time that you came up with?
Yeah, so a lot of the named characters that we depicted are actual people that I know both Alex and I delighted in learning more about. Like Kathy Barbarian was a wormhole that I know both of us enjoyed going down tremendously. And I didn't, prior to painting her, I didn't know what she looked like. Chino and Daddy G is G. Gordon Liddy. Um, I have it on good authority that Peg is actually Peggy Lipton, and so that's her
Mm.
face there.
Yeah, right.
And there are Mr. Parker, Charlie Parker, blah blah. So in those instances, I used a melange of reference photos from ye old Google. But this was all during lockdown, and so normally I would have had I would have enlisted people in my life to sit and pose and do various things, but you could not be in proximity to people because of COVID. So I took a lot of pictures of myself posing and used my own body as a reference for various things. And I had a folder on my computer called the Dan Casting Gallery that was full of found photos, photos of my family members, photos of friends. When I talked about this while we were doing it to various friends, they would be like, "Ooh, can I be such and such?" Like the Gaucho is actually Torkel Campbell
Yeah.
from the band Stars, who's a massive Dan fan,
Hmm.
and I talked to him about it, and he was like, "Joan, can I be the Gaucho?" And I was like, "Torque, you're the Gaucho, man." And then Dr. Wu is my dear friend and ex, Dave, and Dave Depper, who plays guitar in Death Cab for Cutie, and he and I used to have a cat together who we named Dr. Wu, who is still alive and kicking, a wonderful, beautiful Siamese cat. So he had to be Dr. Wu. So there's stuff like that. And in the folder, I also had a lot of images um, from clothing catalogs and sewing catalogs from the 60s and 70s. I looked at a lot of advertisement just for rough outfit inspiration. And I just made a bunch of stuff up. That's the thing. I mean, there's a lot of there are a lot of real weird paintings in here. Like the painting, there's a little spot illustration of the soul survivors, and I think I painted them all with like these solid color kind of leisure suits with red confetti all over them. I don't know. I kind of remember being in some strange fever state um, when I did that. So a lot of it is just straight ridiculousness.
I really like that one because they look like a Christian family band of some kind.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
like the like
Yeah.
we're the Mercs, and like we all sing together, and our father raised us to say that, like a Mormon kind of like, you know, but like not a less successful Osmonds.
The dad plays guitar, the girls sing harmony, and
Yep.
there's
one of those.
nothing distinguishing about the guitar sound.
Yeah.
Like the bad white staple singers.
Yeah, we all have matching suits though. Like we really made the commitment, at least to presentation, if not to the aesthetic.
You know why? Because mommy's made us
I love it.
our whole lives. It's like dark.
Yeah.
This is the other pitch is just to keep expanding the Steely Dan universe. Like, you've created these characters, now they can go on and you can have prequels and sequels and all kinds of
take liberties.
Yeah, exactly. Merchandise,
Steely Dan songs that never existed, the characters that would have been in them.
Just that's what you know. We need to turn this into IP, is what I'm saying. Okay, so let's talk about classic albums, Asia. This film. So there's this, for people who don't know, and I'm sorry if you don't, but Classic Albums was the series that seems to be going on. It's been on for 20 some years. I think it's a British thing. And it is, like, they're like 45 minutes to an hour long, kind of, you know, just like picking a classic album from, you know, the Rolling Stones classic album list and do a movie about it. And they're kind of low budget. Usually they're just talking to the artist, the producer. There's a lot of guys, mostly guys, sitting by the big mixing board. So if you're into that genre of rock doc, which is guys sitting by a big mixing board talking about a record, they're for you. A lot of them are on Amazon. You can watch them for free. This one is on Amazon for free. So yeah, check that out.
We've many a classic albums episode has been referenced on our show, but this is the first full episode we've done.
Yeah, it's long overdue.
Yeah, the band's the Brown album by the band has a great episode, and that has come up repeatedly, I think. Levon really has a star turn in that film.
I mean,
sitting at the board, of course.
Yeah, and this director, Alan Lewens, he hasn't done anything that I can see for like the last 15 years, but he's known, like he did an episode of a TV series which was based on grumpy old men movies. You know, he's like that kind of guy, like a kind of working director, lifer kind of guy. This is the only one of the classic album series, as far as I can tell, that he did, but boy, knocked it out of the park. So yeah, I mean, in terms of what we get is late 90s, post or during the reunion, but before the new albums came out, Don and Walt talking about Asia, going song by song, and then just cutting between them and the producer and various other guests. And the whole thing is just Don and Walt's attitude. You get the most, I mean, there's no other document like this that I know of. Maybe you guys do.
It's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but instead of hanging out with Brad Pitt and Leo, you're hanging out with Walt and Don. We're just hanging out with Walt and Don for an hour. It's great.
It's fabulous. So Alex, you've seen this many times. Like, how did you first come across this, or what? I don't know. Give us your like overall take on this film.
Yeah, I think that there was a moment it's probably the early 2000s was probably the first time I saw this, and it coincided with my kind of just growing interest in Steely Dan, and also, but more importantly, like my first time knowing other people who were Steely Dan fans, because I was working at a rock magazine. I was friends with a bunch of people who worked at rock magazines, and like or people who were friends with those people, and therefore kind of shared some common interests. And we were all kind of getting deeper into the Dan and really kind of thinking about them a lot and hanging out and talking about them, listening to those records and everything. And, there is, as you sort of, alluded to, there was very little at that time, visual information, especially about Steely Dan. They sort of seem to exist in print, like they kind of just exist in black ink. They're like cartoon characters or something. And this was the one way that you could see them kind of talking and moving around and explaining things, because they kind of missed out on the whole kind of golden age of music video. They didn't really participate in that. There's very there was footage, but there's very isolated concert footage from the early days. And so this was really like the document if you wanted to see Don and Walter kind of moving and talking and sort of but also like just sort of betraying zero investment in like the larger significance of what they're doing. Like, I think you use the word attitude, and I think that's what you really get, because it's like, I haven't seen very many classic albums, but I assume that everybody else is like a little more excited to be on classic albums than they were. Like,
yes. Yeah.
In some way that there maybe just have some kind of like, it's
there's a very like, yeah, I'll do that, I guess, element to it. Like I mean, sure, I'll do it. I'll sit here and talk about this.
A little bit of a hostage video vibe with Walt's like conversations in the stairwell.
Well, yeah, it's very ad hoc. It's very sort of like nobody's against a good background. Like, I think so. This worked for me on two levels, because it was a vital document of a band that I wanted to know everything I could possibly know about, in a band that sort of fascinated me. But it works as a like, there is a really fun kind of cheapness and an uncinematic cheapness to it. Like a lot of especially like when you get into like Roger Nichols, the engineer, and Gary Katz, the producer, like a lot of them seem like they didn't know, like the crew just showed up at their house and they didn't know what was happening. They were like, oh shit, that was today. Okay, we can do it here. I got, and like they thought it maybe was a podcast and not a film, and so they're just wearing whatever they had on for the thing. And it's slightly better when you get into Donald and Walter, but not really. And so I think that and you got all this like B-roll footage,
so much B-roll,
stock B-roll footage. So
yeah, it's amazing. The content of this is like, yeah, these interviews, and then what you get is a Steely Dan in the studio now. So like they basically put together some version of the Asia band to jam on these songs instrumentally. So you got Don and Walt, you got Bernard Purdie, the drummer, who I want to talk. I could just shut off everybody's mic and talk about him for 20 minutes. Chuck Rainey
steals the show,
playing the bass. And so they just, it's like they can only get 10-15 minutes of interview footage out of them, and then they jam. And there's a little bit of contemporary, like late 90s live stuff. And it's sort of like, we have to fill out this much content, and this is what we have. So it really is charming in a kind of weird, un-Steely Dan sloppy way. I don't know. It kind of,
that's well said.
It brings a little warmth to the, strangely enough, to the whole Steely Dan thing. And I maybe I'm just projecting that, but I felt, there's something below that.
Well, they certainly have some attitude toward the proceedings, but also, they're willing participants. They're having fun. They crack each other up for sure. Walt and Don, you can like really see them entertaining each other, and you can see how they have this, how they were partners for so long. They have a shared sense of humor completely. Also, I'll say, this movie is now like about as old as Asia was when they made this movie.
Yeah.
Sobering.
Yeah, it's shocking. Time we're all being left behind.
Shit.
Yeah, that's terrifying. So just to kind of set the scene, it starts, they do a little quick speed run through the history of Steely Dan, very perfunctory. Then we get, they're just talking about the songs. So they're talking about Josie. You get Donald Fagen. He's got this like really bad pencil mustache happening. And it's not like a John Waters. It's more like a tracing the upper line of his lip kind of situation.
Dustache, I like to call it.
Yeah. And yeah. And so like basically his comment about Josie, and there's just no way to like possibly replicate his like New York or outer borough or whatever attitude, but he says yeah, Josie, he's got the stuff that a good R&B record has, like a Junior Parker record or Bobby Blue Bland, pause, plus some other stuff. Like, that's what you're gonna get. Yes. Right up front.
Doesn't he actually say, I kind of like Josie? I feel like it's They're like, are there any songs on this record that you like? And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, but he also, the mustache, because he looks like a jewel thief. Like he looks like he's explaining, like the statute of limitations is up, and he's like, I'm going to tell you how I stole the Koh-i-Noor emeralds from the British Museum.
That's so much, so perfect. I love it. Yeah. So I don't know that we need to go through every song, kind of in
Well,
great detail,
Well,
but
we do get Chuck Rainey here
Yeah.
with a really fun anecdote about how
Yes.
he was playing the bass line and sort of like taking their ideas and making them his own and tricking them in some ways. It's
I love that. Yeah, I love that. I love the thing about the slap bass where he was like, they didn't want me to do it, so I just turned my chair, and they couldn't tell until later. It's like, yeah, exactly. It's like, because you can just 1,000% picture it, like him being in the studio all day and then swiveling. They'll never know until they listen to
right.
the
Yeah. And like he gets one over on him that like then they hear it and they're like, ooh, there it is. And he's like, yeah, you guys wanted you wanted slap bass. You didn't know you wanted it though.
Yeah, his attitude is great. I think Walt says about him, like, he's a great player. He revoices certain chords in an interesting way. It's like they don't bother to explain these things unless you know what that means. It is totally meaningless, but it just sounds like a smart music thing to say, and it works.
But they do have the thing that's great about this, and I think, like, we can goof all day, and I hope we do, on like the sort of the kind of overall like mise en scène of it. But like the thing that this show has, because it comes out of like the idea for it came from like there was an episode of the South Bank show, the arts show in Britain, where where George Martin demonstrated, like, literally like took Beatles stems and like played, like, okay, here we're gonna isolate Ringo and we're gonna fade things up and down. And I guess that was a segment, and like that was the idea for this show, came out of that. So it's kind of like the song exploder of its day, like that it's that it has it's the same principle. And like, so what you do get that's amazing, like there is a lot of arcane, like what does it mean to revoice a chord, but you also get isolated, they're playing isolated tracks throughout, like they keep cutting back to them playing like little bits and pieces of Asia, and so you get to hear what that bass line sounded like on its own, and sort of how and all of that. And so like I think that's sort of the greatest thing about this, if you're obsessed with these records, is that you suddenly get to like hear the puzzle pieces on their own, separate, and like how they fit together, and how like these sounds were actually the result of like these weird interactions between two instruments, thing like that. I cannot get enough of that. Like this could be a 4-hour movie of them fading things up and down, and I would be right there.
Yeah.
Same.
So that stuff is really great because like you get to hear that stuff. You get, as an obsessive, you get to hear all the pieces of it and then talk about it. And you really, they put it together well, and they know how to talk about it, of course. But also sometimes they just can't even like resist their own temptation to be able to play with it all. Like they have a train of thought, and then all of a sudden the other one just starts pressing different buttons. They're like, wait, what about this though? And they completely abandon the thread that they were on, just to like be like, what if we did so they're like finding stuff that they had forgotten. They're like, oh, where did we put that? Why did we have this? And they like reverse engineer their own thinking from 25 years earlier. They're like, we probably wanted it to fill this one area, and like they get really excited, like, yeah, I think you're right. I think that is what we were thinking.
Yeah, I love when they isolate the MIDI strings and Fagen on I guess that is on Josie Baby, and or maybe it's on Peg. It's on Peg. And Fagen's like, it sounds as bad as it did 25 years ago, but da 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 da. Like, clowning the ISO tracks, and he's like, but then when you exactly what Alex was saying, but then when you bring this up, see, it makes the sound we wanted it to make. But yeah, getting to see how the sausage is made is just popcorn.
Yep.
Yeah, the best of that. I mean, if you remember one, I think, scene from this film is the Peg guitar solo bit. It is the greatest. I texted Andy when I was rewatching it the other day, like, this is probably my favorite scene in the entire category of music documentaries. It's
so funny. It's
so So the song Peg has this famous guitar solo, but they're talking about how, for people who don't know this stuff, I mean, Steely Dan at this time was just really just Don and Walt primarily. And they would just bring in the best of the best of the best studio musicians to play for months these songs, like in different combinations. And they knew what they wanted. But it's like they had this psychic bond between the two of them. They knew what they wanted, and just making that happen in the world, they could only communicate it through making, I'm not saying this very well for a podcaster. So, they had to just burn through tons of musicians. This was not a band where it's the set members of the band. So they're just talking about how they had trying to figure out this guitar solo for Peg. And they're like, yeah, we had 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 players come in.
So they just keep adding numbers. It's like a bidding war in Succession. They just keep saying a higher number.
So that, yeah, exactly. Yeah. You don't even know what the numbers mean, but it's compelling. 42. Wow. Okay. So what they do is they start bringing up these discarded guitar solos that were not part of the thing. And they play one, and they don't say who the players are, which is, I guess, nice of them.
Yeah.
And they play one, and Don just goes, well, there you go. In other words, it speaks for itself, really.
Yeah, so it says something like that. It just absolutely dismisses it out of hand.
And then the next one, Don says, he listens to it. He's like, yeah, there's some kind of envelope filter on the guitar. He listens to the solo. He goes,
no. He says a little envelope filter.
A little envelope, yeah.
to make it a little bit more diminutive even.
Yeah. And he goes, wouldn't you hate it if someone did this to you? Guitar solo that probably one of the world's greatest musicians came in and did.
Whoever that was obviously an incredible musician to ever even be in that room.
This is like the sickest subtweet of all time.
Yeah, 25 years later, just gets slayed.
And in the same Peg section, we also get the appearance of boy, just what a cameo, Michael McDonald, knocking it out of the park. I'm trying to remember exactly how he kind of describes the process of being trained to sing the harmony.
He talks about how hard it was to sing on the note or something.
Well, yeah, because he's harmonizing with himself, and so they had a lot of thoughts about phrasing, but there's at least he's like triple tracked, and they're going for some kind of mix of notes. And this is somebody who's as good a singer as any of those guitarists are at playing guitar, and he's operating at the outside edge, of what he's capable of. But that's also why people wanted to play and sing and stuff on Steely Dan records. They got to do things that were maybe that they never got to do in other contexts. It's I think about Rick Marotta talking about his hi-hat. How he'd play the hi-hat a little bit open, and he'd sort of open it up a little bit on each, beat or whatever. And, not only did he sort of get to do that, the records were engineered in such a way and recorded in such a way that you could actually hear it. And I think people appreciated that too. And so if imagine you're a session musician from the 70s or whatever, or you're Michael McDonald and you're just going in to sort of, you're singing on a Christopher Cross record in the morning, and then you get this opportunity to do this really complex kind of choral music thing for Peg. I think that's you're living the dream in some ways, even though they are these sort of hard taskmasters, and but
absolutely.
The only guy who
I was going to say
the only guy who comes in.
It's I was going to say, that what you're putting down is actually going to be represented the way that you want it to be represented.
Right.
If it makes the cut.
Right.
Yeah. And
yeah.
If
Mike always made the cut though, because there wasn't another Michael McDonald waiting in the wings. That was the one advantage you had of being that, because he's such a distinctive voice, and there were very few people who could do that. There's 100 guys who could play guitar that well. That's the difference.
So one of the things you write about in the book, Alex, is the sort of the reclaiming of Steely Dan that has occurred in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And this movie came out at the absolute nadir of whether Steely Dan was cool to like. But this movie was made when Dan fans were scattered to the wind and only knew of each other by rumor, you know,
Hunted, despised.
Yeah.
We
Right,
had to keep it on the
chased
low.
to the edges of their tribal lands, and so I don't know, what do you make of the reclaiming of Dan and sort of as part of the whole reclaiming of everything that we've been going through for the last 15 years, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think that. Well, I mean, first of all, I think classic albums, memes have a lot to do with it. There's a lot of really sort of iconic, sort of hilarious Don and Walt moments that make their way into the cultural groundwater from this one movie, because this is one of the few times that somebody really just had a camera on them and sort of captured that relationship. So I think that's important, and it becomes memes where you see a shot of the two of them at the console, and it says like, oh, don't mind us, we're just mixing the sex tape we made with your mom, or something like that. And that's a big part of like how people get curious about Steely Dan, is stuff like that. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's the sort of the long story, slightly short version is that. There's very little retro left that hasn't been kind of like turned over, and at some point you start to turn to the things that were sort of maybe classically uncool in your conception of things, and that's how that happens. And I think people sort of maybe you come to Steely Dan ironically, and you end up loving them sincerely because you sort of realize that, oh, they're in this for irony as well, and that's that's the level that they're working on. So they kind of meet you on the level that you're imagining that you're above it, but then they're there as well. That sounds a little mystical somehow. Yeah, so I think it's part of that. I think it's that, but I think it's that. I think it's honestly, I think this movie showcases a lot of the reasons why, because they are both hilarious weirdos and worked with and were themselves sort of astonishingly creative musicians. And I think you see both of those things kind of working in tandem in this weird film, which I honestly feel is like one of the best. It ends up being one of the best portraits of them that we have. And we don't have a lot, like in terms, especially in terms of video.
Yeah, I think the fact that they were like kind of considered uncool for so long, even after this movie, like when they won the Grammy, and beat like Radiohead and Beck and whoever, there was like an uproar, and sort of makes the Reclamation project, gives it, makes them sort of underdogs, even though they like succeeded beyond everybody's wildest dreams. And it's such a weird story. I mean, I feel like, this Reclamation thing, like I feel like I woke up 6 months ago and all of a sudden we were supposed to like new metal. And I'm not sure I'm on board. I'm not sure. I think maybe I'm not jumping on that bus.
I keep hearing people say stuff like, well, obviously Korn was really good. And I'm like, what is going on? Like,
Okay, so I'm going to say we talked a little bit. It came up at our Brooklyn event that we did. One of the things that we were somebody, I believe it was Jason Diamond, who was our moderator, asked the question, like, what's the, if this reclamation of Steely Dan is happening now, like, what is the thing from now or from recent history that's going to be reclaimed in the same way? And we sort of it's hard to think about that, because like things don't get forgotten in quite the same way, and though they don't pass into uncoolness, and things don't go away as much. So it needs to be something that's devalued at the moment that will then sort of reveal value to another generation. And we kind of kicked around some answers with the crowd, and then afterwards, Gordon from Double Wonderful, who made this gaucho hat and a bunch of other things, incredible t-shirt design guy, was like, it came up to me and was like, the answer is Korn. It's Korn. And I can't imagine that, but that's why it's probably right.
Yes.
I mean, it's just like when I think back to the era when you were writing a popular, or a favorable Steely Dan passage on Pitchfork, and everyone else was crushing Steely Dan on Pitchfork. like I think back to that time, and it's unfathomable to me as a Grateful Dead fan that they would have had the like broad critical reappreciation that they have had since say like 2015 or so. Like it really is what I couldn't have imagined that like that indie critics would have takes on their favorite Grateful Dead shows. And like in retrospect now, like you know, I guess Korn doesn't sound that much crazier to me than I think like, you know, Steely Dan or Grateful Dead being cool in 2000 would have sounded at the time.
No, I mean, I think there's I grew up internalizing the tastes and the prejudices of critics and also just listeners and fans who were like about maybe 5 to 10 years older than me, and there is something about, I think, if you had been sort of participated in like the kind of year zero of like punk in like 77, 78, those kinds of things, and you were really about like we're not going, we're throwing the past out, the idea of going back to even to the Dead. But then at the same time, it's like these are, they're not even really aesthetic prejudices, they're just sort of kind of I don't know that they're, at least for me, it was like when I sort of thought that stuff was not for me, it was not informed by any kind of lived experience of it. It was informed by ideas about it. And what you realize, as I'm sure you know, and I was saying this to my friend the other day, is that when you go back and listen to the Dead, it's like they're like a Drag City band. Like they just sound, that's like that's who they would have been if they had emerged in 1991. Like that's where they would have been. And I think that there's just so much more going on in this music than but like I understand where it all came from. I understand like that Steely Dan were the absolute enemy if you sort of found professionalism and perfectionism and smoothness to be the enemy, and if you were looking for things that were always going to be sort of abrasive or kind of a little bit off kilter, a little bit fucked up, like if that was kind of what if that was what signified authenticity to you in music, this was going to sound like dentist's office music to you. But once you realize that they're as eccentric as anybody else in their own way, and again I feel like you get that from this film in some ways.
Well, when I was first listening to Steely Dan was like when I was a high schooler and I first got a car and they were on classic rock radio. Sure. And like putting them in that context is like you lose so much of what they are, and so I didn't think of them the way people mostly think of them until years later when somebody told me to take a deeper look. But that said, even when they were that other thing, the stuff that was played alongside CSNY, or whatever, and I would hear like Reel in the Ears, I liked it, like I unironically liked it, and then I ironically liked it, and then went back to unironically liking it again. It's and and that that was all basically at the time this movie was coming out.
I kind of wonder for you guys about Steely Dan. One thing they don't do in this movie, or really hardly ever, is to really discuss the songwriting, like the lyrics and the characters, which is what your book's primarily about. And with this kind of thing, I always wonder, especially about like the 70s era, because I don't, I barely, I was born in 76, so I definitely was not like aware of what was going on at that time. But like, how much of their kind of characters and what the world that they're creating and describing is like reportage, meaning they're looking around and just like sort of, turning what they see into music, versus sort of mythologizing it in a way, like like the Old West, or the like detective stories or something, where like we all know that none of that stuff really happened. It's all just complete. It's like the Knights of the Round Table. It's just made up. But we can't. It's so in our minds that we can't escape. If you talk about the Old West, you're thinking of like a John Wayne cowboy movie. You're not thinking of like probably what it was really like. So I don't know. In terms of you guys, like digging into the lyrics, like you guys have done that much more than than maybe I ever will have the chance to. How much of this is sort of a fantasy world they created versus them really reacting and finding a way to process